You are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview James Darnborough. James is the author of the historical fiction novel The Gambler's Game, which is based on the real-life story of his grandfather, Bill Darnborough. I'm here with James Darnborough. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yes, I did. Darnborough. Yes, you did. Thank you.
Who is the author of the upcoming historical fiction book, The Gambler's Game. James, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
My name's James Darnborough, and I'm originally from London in the UK, and I'm now lucky enough to live in LA in Southern California, where the weather is considerably nicer.
Now, as this question is going to lead into the question about your book, tell us a few things about your grandfather, Bill Darnborough.
Bill Darnborough was born in 1869, and he was born on a farm in southern Illinois, and one of two children, and life was pretty tough. He had a gift for throwing baseballs very, very fast. And of course, in those days, they couldn't actually measure how fast, but I'm guessing about 100 miles an hour. Anyway, he eventually got signed by Denver, and that was his ticket out, because the baseball players in those days, this is around the turn of the last century, so the late 1880s, they were like the movie stars of today, the baseball players, and they got to travel and go to exciting places. And he ended up becoming a roulette player, and he was in fact the only American to break the Bank of Monte Carlo. So that in itself is quite an extraordinary story. And so I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to share this story. And so I've written a book called The Gambler's Game, which is, it could have been a biography, but to make it more interesting, I turned it into historical fiction, which means I can bring all the characters are real, all the people are real, all the places are real, but I could bring it all to life, and I could have interaction and dialogue and adventure. So that's what we've got.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about your book, The Gambler's Game, and without spoiling too much of your book, can you tell us a little bit more about it, and when is it scheduled to be released?
The release date is February the 12th, 2024. And if you go to the website, which is called thegamblersgame.com, if you sign up for that, then you can get updates, newsletters. We're about to reveal the cover and all kinds of exciting things going on. And it's going to be ebook. The audio narration is being recorded this week, right now. And I was very lucky to find someone who can narrate with a Midwestern American accent, but can also do French and Italian accents. And there's quite a lot happens in Mexico City. So to find someone that good was very, very difficult, because we can all do accents, and maintain accents, but to have someone who can flip between different accents was a real challenge. And so I'm very happy that it's going to be available to everyone on audiobook as well.
Now, I'm going to let you know I'm actually from East Central Illinois, a community called Westville that is in the east central part of the state near the Illinois-Indiana border. And Southern Illinois, now what part of Southern Illinois was Bill from?
He's from a place called Mascoutah, which is the nearest big landmark is St. Louis. So it's kind of down by the Missouri border. And it's very rural, it's farmland. There's a little town near there called Lebanon, which is named after the tree, not the place in the Middle East. And if you go north about 150 miles, you get to Bloomington, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yeah, that's a northwest of me along Interstate 74.
Exactly right. So Bloomington is where Bill got his first break, and he played baseball for Bloomington. And a few years later, when he'd finished with his baseball, he opened up his own casino, which was on North Central Street in Bloomington, and it was opposite the courthouse, which is now the Museum of History. And so we have photographs, and I've actually been inside the building, which extraordinary that it's Bloomington's the most beautiful town. It's the most wonderful town, and in right in the center there is what you would now call the historical district, and they've been very careful to maintain a lot of the architecture and the buildings and things like street lamps from 120 years ago. And it's extraordinary to go in there. The other thing that I didn't realize is because I saw photographs of this and I thought, well, that looks like a shop front, but actually the building is really, really deep. So he had a restaurant in the front, so that looks very, very harmless and or very nice. But in the back was this casino, and it was perfectly legal, and everyone went there. And that's how he got really good at roulette. Actually, was watching other people lose.
Sometimes the best way to learn about something is see people either fail or be unlucky at something.
Exactly. And I mean, he was there for years and years, and so it must have been extraordinary to see the amount of different kind of people that go in there, rich, poor, sober or otherwise, with money to burn or not. And so I've put a lot of interactions there with, because there's this really tough situation that you find yourself in where there's people who are your friends and that they really should stop because you've seen over a period of time that the standard of their dress has deteriorated. And, on the one hand, you've got a business to run, and you want that to be successful, but on the other hand, you don't want your friends to lose their money. I've got an interesting fact about this actually. In Monte Carlo, the casino in Monte Carlo, nobody from Monte Carlo is allowed in there unless they work there, and that was the deal that was originally done in the 1860s. And then that was interesting to find out.
I actually learned about that watching. I think it was not the Formula One Monaco Grand Prix. It was like a Formula E, which is electric open wheel car series, where they ran a race on the famous Monaco street circuit, and I think Bob Varsha was the American announcer for the broadcast, and he mentioned that Monegasque citizens are not allowed to gamble at the casino in their home country.
That's right. And in exchange, they don't pay income tax. So it was very clever. It was Prince Albert originally who made the deal with Francois Blanc, who started the casino in the 1860s. And the deal was as simple as that. I don't want my country to become bankrupt. We need this to be a profitable venture. And the way to do that is we take other people's money. So Monaco is one of the very few places in the world where, since the Grimaldi family took over in about the 1100s, so nearly 1,000 years, they have never given anything away. They've been incredibly clever, and the casino is wonderful as an experience. But it's like everything, you've really got to know what you're doing to be successful there. And that's what this story is about.
Now, will the Gambler's Game be self-published, traditionally published, or published by a hybrid press?
Well, this is very interesting because at the moment, the most popular stories are sort of fantasy, and they are focusing on marginalized, and this is a kind of a mixture of Downton Abbey meets Gilded Age meets Monte Carlo, and it's baseball, and So I submitted this to something like 180 literary agents, and it just doesn't fit into what is currently top of the list. But I know it's really hard, isn't it? Because if you're a big publisher, what you wanted last Monday is not what you want today. Today you want romance. Last week you wanted science fiction. So in the end, I found a small publishing company that I made a deal with. Because the difference between self-publishing and using a big publishing house is who owns the copyright, who owns the rights. And I want this to go onto the screen. I mean, this is perfect for an 8-part series on HBO or Netflix or whatever. It absolutely should be adapted. And so to have as much control as possible on that is great. But, these days, there are so many resources out there. I mean, the difference between self-publishing 5 years ago and now is huge. So, there are hybrid organizations, but there are people that you can pick up along the way that can help, like designers. There's no way I could design a cover. I trim sizes and bleeds and all the rest of it. You may think you know it, but to be confident, find someone who can help. And I think that's a really important message, actually, is to, a lot of writers feel like they're alone and it's a lonely existence and they're locked away in a basement for years and don't speak to anybody. And it's important to reach out and ask for help. And so I did, and I'm very lucky.
Why did you write your book as an historical fiction novel and not as a nonfiction biography?
Great question. I don't think that I'm good enough to write a biography. There are people who write biographies of one of Henry VIII's wives without the ability to get any kind of first-hand information or interviews or anything. I don't know how they do it. I couldn't do that. I wanted to stick to the facts, so I did an enormous amount of research. And there's 173 different characters in this book, and 90% of them are real people. So these are real baseball players with the most magnificent moustaches. They're Eugene Madden's bar saloon in Denver. The barman was called Michael Flattery from Kilkenny in Ireland, and I have a photograph of him. And so the interactions with these guys, his brother-in-law was the police chief. I mean, they're all real people. But so what I did is I wrapped it in a novel, which means I can have dialogue. So I can have them talking to each other. And then, so for example, there's a train robbery, it's a train holdup, and the guys who are actually committing the holdup are real people who were eventually caught by the Pinkertons, like Pegleg Watson. I mean, all these people are extraordinary. And the way that I was able to do that is you can find newspapers from tiny little towns all over the world. There are amazing people who spend their whole lives scanning and uploading newspapers from 150 years ago, and you can find them all now. So this is something that wouldn't have been possible 5-10 years ago. So that's the reason that it was I think it's difficult to categorize everything these days, but I think they call it historical biographical fiction, if you want to get technical on categories. But and that made it fun. That's made the story a real adventure, and it's fast paced, and it made the experience fun for me as well, because I could bring the characters to life.
I'm going to ask the next two questions as a single two-part question. How long did it take you to write The Gambler's Game, and how much research did you do for The Gambler's Game?
I thought that I'd be done in a year, and I began by writing and researching simultaneously. I get about 4 hours a night, and that was nice because it was quiet, and I was on my own. And it ended up being 3 years, and during that time, I have physically, I've been to Monte Carlo to meet with all the directors of the casino who are so excited about this and that they're endorsing the book. And I've been to London, Mexico City, Denver, Colorado, and I actually drove through Illinois. So I went from Bloomington down to the Missouri border. So I think a lot of people will tell you that when you think you've finished, you're only just starting, because the editing process was pretty tough. I've got to be honest; it was pretty brutal. I'll give you one quick example. So I'm English. We're not very good at describing emotions, our own emotions, let alone describing emotions of characters that we've created in the book, particularly ladies. So I had to get some independent help on that. And I was very lucky to find someone who's actually in Long Island, and she writes historical fiction novels, and she helped with that. So that's the thing, is that you can do as much as you can do, then you need to ask for help. And then you need to edit and re-edit and re-edit and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. I've done, I don't know, 12 drafts of this because I wanted it to be the best version that it could possibly be, so that when it's actually out there, I can sleep at night in the confidence that I know I've done everything I possibly could to make it the best version it could be.
What was life in the Midwestern United States like in your grandfather's time?
These were very resourceful people. You had to be. And it was survival. It's all very well when we look at characters from history like the Vanderbilts and Rockefellers and the Astors, and those kind of people who are portrayed in series like The Gilded Age, but the reality was the main thing was to honestly just to survive. But there were a few things that made life quite convenient. For example, the railways. And I didn't actually realize. So I live in LA, where the public transport is practically non-existent. And what I didn't realize is that in around, let's say, 1895, there was this spider's web of railway lines all over America. I mean, the whole of North America, including Mexico. And it was incredibly easy to get around. And in many instances, quite luxurious. So they had these Pullman carriages, which had sleeper berths and dining cars. And so the train, everything took a really long time because there were so many stops. But so the train would stop, and those who couldn't afford to be in the dining car would jump out and they'd get food and beer and everything else that they needed, stretch their legs and whatever, and carry on. And there was this real sort of, life. A lot of the trains had their own printing presses, so they could print newspapers on the train and sell them on the train. It was amazing. So, Hollywood, of course, has changed the reality of what life was like in the West. There certainly weren't guns weren't allowed in saloons, and it was very, very unusual for that to happen. And you can read, if you do the research enough, you could read individual cases of things, big events that we all know about, like the OK Corral. But otherwise, I think that I can understand. Here's one thing I just thought of. I can understand why Prohibition arrived, because that was a real problem. But interesting for a gambler on the road, you could find yourself in some pretty dangerous environments, like up in the mining towns in Nevada, like Eureka and places like that, where they discovered silver. That was you don't want to get in debt. You want to pay your gambling debts is the only advice if you find yourself in a time machine going back to those days.
One final question. You worked in the media business in a few different countries where the English language is spoken by either a majority or a statistically significant minority of people, and that's the UK, South Africa, in Australia. What was it like to work in the media business in those countries?
Oh, it was great. It was absolutely amazing. I went to South Africa when I was pretty young. I was 20. And this was before the internet. So I had an idea to publish magazines I published a PGA Golf magazine and Rugby World Cup magazines and things like that. And there was no internet. So this was in the days when people still read magazines. And I was just very lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And also, I mean, the main reason that I spent my 20s in South Africa and my 30s in Australia, then I came to California. And the main reason for that is that I have an aversion to cold weather and rain. And so I just got up and left. And I think that, experiencing different cultures is so important. And it's funny because that has really helped in this latest project of mine, doing this book, because I wouldn't have been able to do it in the way that I did it if I hadn't lived in Europe and in the USA, for example. So this is about an American who emigrates to England. And, he's my grandfather. And that's why I've got this ridiculous accent, is because my father was born in England. So, but I think travel is so important. And I've been really lucky to have made sure that I've got my fair bit of traveling in. But I've got to tell you, I love the States. I love Southern California. And I'm so incredibly lucky to be here. I feel like I've graduated by being here.
James, I enjoyed conversing with you very much, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, Aaron, and thank you so much for inviting me.
It was wonderful to interview James, and I found the story behind his book to be very fascinating. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.